Tuesday, May 16, 1944. Camp Clarinda, Iowa, United States of America. Oberleutnant zur See Klaus Hartmann stood motionless before a cafeteria table, his salt-crusted hands trembling as they hovered over something impossible. White bread! Not one loaf, not two. 17 loaves, stacked casually on steel trays, steam still rising from their golden crusts. The smell hit him like a physical blow. Yeast, butter, warmth. His knees buckled slightly. Around him, 43 other German prisoners stood in similar postures of disbelief, some with tears tracking down faces that hadn't seen proper food in months. The American guard leaning against the wall looked bored, casually chewing gum. Chewing gum. As if abundance was tedium. Das ist nicht möglich, Klaus whispered. This is not possible, but the heat radiating from the bread was real. The moisture gathering in his mouth was real. The impossible, devastating, world-shattering reality was real. Klaus Hartmann had been a U-boat man for 3 years. 3 years in the iron coffins they called submarines, hunting convoys across the grey North Atlantic. 3 years breathing air thick with diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and fear. 3 years eating mouldy bread that had to be scraped before consumption, dried sausage hard as wood, and bitter ersatz coffee that bore no relation to the real thing. 3 years believing absolutely in German superiority, in the inevitable victory of the Reich, in the propaganda that assured them America was a decadent nation of weaklings tearing itself apart. He had been captured 4 days ago when depth charges from a British destroyer had forced U-673 to the surface 200 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. The submarine had taken too much damage to dive again. As freezing Atlantic water rushed into the control room, Klaus and his crewmates had scrambled through the conning tower hatch, abandoning their boat to the depths. The destroyer had picked them up, soggy, shivering, defeated. They'd expected execution. They'd received hot soup and wool blankets instead. Then had come the transport ship to Halifax. Then the train. And now this. Iowa. He'd never heard of Iowa. The propaganda ministry's maps showed America as a thin coastal strip with nothing behind it. Industrial centers around New York and Chicago, they'd said, surrounded by vast primitive wilderness inhabited by cowboys and Indians. A nation stretched too thin, they'd promised, collapsing under its own contradictions, torn apart by racial conflict and labor strikes, barely able to feed its own people. Klaus had grown up in Bremen, a port city that knew the sea's moods. His father had worked the docks until the Depression closed them. Klaus remembered the hunger years, 1930, 1931, 1932, when his mother had watered down the soup until it was barely more than hot salt water with a few potato peels floating in it. He remembered the communist riots, the street battles, the chaos. Then the Führer had come, and there had been order. And jobs. And purpose. And the promise that Germany would never be weak again. He'd joined the Kriegsmarine in 1941, volunteering for U-boat service because it was elite, dangerous, prestigious. The training had been brutal. The service was worse. A U-boat was essentially a steel tube, 44 meters long and 4 meters wide, crammed with machinery, weapons, food supplies, and 50 men who couldn't properly wash for weeks at a time. The smell was indescribable. A mixture of diesel oil, battery acid, sweat, urine, rotting food, and bilge water that permeated everything. Your clothes, your skin, your hair. Veterans said you could identify a U-boat man by smell alone, even weeks after he'd left the boat. The cold was constant, North Atlantic cold that seeped through the pressure hull and settled in your bones. The condensation dripped constantly, making everything perpetually damp. Mold grew on the bread within days. The only warmth came from the diesel engines when they ran on the surface, and from the packed bodies of men sleeping in shifts in bunks so narrow you had to lie motionless. Food was monotonous and diminishing. They'd leave port with fresh provisions that would last perhaps a week. Real meat, real bread, eggs, milk. Then it was canned goods, dried meats, hardtack, and whatever wouldn't spoil. By the end of a 2-month patrol, they'd be eating things that would have been thrown away at the beginning of the voyage. Klaus had seen men weep over a mouldy orange, the last piece of fruit on board, its value greater than gold. And yet they'd believed. God, how they'd believed. The officers read them reports of American ships sunk, of convoys scattered, of the enemy bleeding tonnage. They heard about German technological superiority, their submarines versus American merchant ships, their discipline versus American chaos. The propaganda films shown during training had depicted America as a mongrel nation, racially impure, its workers lazy and striking for higher wages, while German workers sacrificed for the fatherland. Roosevelt was a warmonger controlled by Jewish financiers. The American military was poorly trained, poorly equipped, and would crumble when faced with true Germanic fighting spirit. They'd been told American rations were inadequate, that American soldiers were deserting in droves, that the American home front was collapsing under rationing and shortages, that the vaunted American industrial capacity was a fiction, propaganda to match Germany's truth. The numbers they'd been given seemed to confirm it. Germany's U-boat fleet, they were told, was sinking ships faster than America could build them. German industry was producing sufficient submarines, sufficient weapons, sufficient everything. The thousand-year Reich would triumph through superiority of will and blood. Klaus had never questioned it. Why would he? Every authority figure he'd known had confirmed it. His teachers, his officers, the radio broadcasts, the newsreels. To doubt was to question the foundation of everything. What Klaus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the numbers were lies built on lies. Germany had entered the war with 57 U-boats. By 1944, they'd lost over 600. For every convoy attacked, more escorts appeared. For every ship sunk, 10 more reached port. The industrial arithmetic was devastatingly simple, had anyone been allowed to see it clearly. Germany produced 21 submarines per month at peak production. America was building merchant ships at a rate of 3 per day. 3 per day. Liberty ships, simple, mass-produced, each one replacing a U-boat's month of hunting within 10 hours of welding and riveting. German U-boat crews received approximately 2,000 calories per day while at sea, and that was when supplies were good. Their American counterparts? 3,500 calories, sometimes more. American POWs in camps like Clarinda? 4,000 calories. The enemy's prisoners ate better than Germany's frontline troops. Steel production in Germany for 1943, 28 million tons. Steel production in America that same year, 81 million tons. Oil production in Germany, dependent on Romanian fields and expensive synthetic fuel plants, 6 million tons annually. Oil production in America, 200 million tons. 200 million? But the most revealing number wasn't about weapons or resources. It was simpler than that, more fundamental. Automobiles. Private automobiles owned by civilians. In Germany in 1944, there were approximately 200,000 private cars still functioning, most requisitioned for military or essential civilian use. Fuel for private driving had been virtually non-existent since 1942. The common German citizen travelled by bicycle, by horse cart, by train if lucky, or by foot. In America in 1944, there were 25 million private automobiles. 25 million! Despite gasoline rationing, despite tyre rationing, despite restrictions on pleasure driving, there were more private civilian cars in America than Germany had produced in its entire automotive history. Klaus would see this with his own eyes, and it would break something fundamental in his understanding of the world. But that realization was still days away. Right now, on this Tuesday morning in May, he was staring at bread. Just bread. White bread. Abundant, fresh, apparently unlimited white bread. The journey to this moment had taken 4 days, and each day had delivered small earthquakes to his certainty. Day 1 had been the destroyer. Klaus had expected brutality. He'd been trained to expect it, told the Allies tortured prisoners for information. That the British especially were vicious toward U-boat crews who'd killed so many of their merchant sailors. Instead, they'd been hauled aboard, stripped of their wet clothes, given blankets and hot sweet tea with actual sugar. A British sailor had offered Klaus a cigarette. A cigarette to a man who'd just tried to kill him. The destroyer's doctor had examined each prisoner, treating minor injuries, checking for hypothermia. Klaus's English was poor, but he understood kindness when he saw it. It confused him. The British were supposed to hate U-boat men above all others. Day 2 had been Halifax, the transit camp where they'd been deloused, showered, hot water, soap that actually lathered, and given clean clothes. American clothes, surplus military fatigues. The shower had been Klaus's first truly hot water in 4 months. He'd stood under the spray until a guard had gestured that time was up, and even then the guard hadn't been cruel about it, just matter of fact. The mess hall in Halifax had served hot food. Not good food exactly, but hot, plentiful, and far better than anything he'd eaten on patrol. Thin beef stew with actual chunks of meat, potatoes, carrots. White bread. He'd eaten carefully, suspicious it was a trick, that it might be drugged or poisoned, or that it would be snatched away before he finished. Nothing happened. When he'd finished his plate, he'd looked around and seen other prisoners going back for seconds. Seconds. He'd assumed it was a one-time thing, special treatment before deprivation set in. Day 3 had been the train. They'd been loaded onto railway cars early in the morning, and Klaus had braced himself for cattle cars, for being packed in without sanitation, for brutality. Instead, they'd been placed in regular passenger carriages, not luxury, but seats. Windows. A guard in each car, but the guards had been young, looked almost as bewildered as the prisoners, and hadn't been aggressive. The train had pulled out of Halifax heading west, and Klaus had watched through the window, expecting to see bombed cities, industrial decay, signs of a nation straining under war's pressure. Instead, he'd seen normalcy. Houses intact, people going about their business. Cars, multiple cars parked on streets, shops open. No obvious damage, no rubble, no desperation. They're hiding the damage, Kapitän Leutnant Werner Stolz had muttered. Stolz had been commander of U-412 before his boat was sunk. He was sitting across from Klaus, his gaunt face pressed to the window. Taking us on routes away from the bombing. Potemkin villages like the Soviets do. It's a propaganda exercise. Klaus had wanted to believe that, but they'd travelled for hours, passing town after town, and nowhere did he see evidence of a nation at the breaking point. The cognitive dissonance gnawed at him. The train had stopped at a small station for refueling. Through the window, Klaus had watched American civilians on the platform. A woman in a bright floral dress laughing. A man carrying groceries, children playing. They looked well-fed. Their clothes weren't patched or threadbare. The woman's dress looked new. An American soldier, rifle slung casually over his shoulder, had been chatting with a pretty girl. He'd offered her a chocolate bar, just offered it, casually, as if chocolate wasn't precious, and she'd laughed and broken off a piece. Klaus hadn't seen real chocolate in over a year. In Germany, children received tiny chocolate rations on special occasions, if they received any at all. And here was this soldier, giving it away to flirt with a girl. Propaganda, Stolz had said firmly, staged for our benefit. But Klaus had started to wonder. How elaborate could the staging be? Were they hiring thousands of actors, dressing entire towns, just to fool a trainload of POWs who would never be able to report what they'd seen anyway? The train had travelled through the night. Klaus had dozed fitfully, his body still adjusting to sleeping horizontally after weeks of the U-boat's watch schedule. When dawn came, he'd looked out the window and seen something that made his breath catch. Farmland. Endless farmland. Fields that stretched to the horizon, green and growing. Neat fence lines dividing properties, barns painted red, silos standing tall. Farm equipment, tractors sitting idle in yards, waiting for planting season to resume. And everywhere space. Vast, incomprehensible space. Klaus had grown up hearing about American agriculture, about the primitive farming methods, about Dust Bowl failures and collapsing rural economies. The propaganda films had shown desperate farmers, foreclosed farms, poverty and failure. What he was seeing through the window was prosperity. The farms looked maintained, successful, abundant. Hour after hour, the farmland had continued. They'd passed through small towns where American flags flew from porches, where main streets had multiple businesses, where people walked freely and didn't look oppressed or desperate or hungry. They'd passed freight trains heading east, laden with goods, coal, lumber, steel, manufactured goods. One train had carried tanks, dozens of them, factory fresh, heading to ports. Stolz had stopped offering explanations. He'd simply sat staring out the window, his jaw tight. Day 4. This morning, arrival at Camp Clarinda. The camp itself had been another shock. Klaus had expected barbed wire and guard towers, searchlights and dogs. Conditions like the camps he'd heard existed in Poland for political prisoners. What he'd found instead was barbed wire, yes, but beyond it, neat barracks buildings painted white, a parade ground, a recreation area, guard towers, but guards who looked bored rather than brutal. The camp looked cleaner and better maintained than some of the Wehrmacht barracks Klaus had seen in Germany. They'd been processed, names recorded, photographs taken, assigned prisoner numbers, given more clean clothes. Then they'd been told it was time for lunch and directed to the mess hall, which brought him back to this moment. Standing before a table covered in fresh white bread, 17 loaves, for 43 men, with more, an American cook had indicated, available if needed. Klaus reached out slowly, expecting someone to stop him, to snatch it away, to reveal this was some elaborate mockery. His fingers touched the crust. It was warm, soft, real. He picked up a loaf. It felt impossibly light compared to the dense, hard bread he was used to. He tore off a piece. The interior was white and fluffy, nothing like the grey, compact rye bread that was standard in Germany. He brought it to his nose. The smell was intoxicating. Wheat, yeast, a hint of sweetness. Around him, other prisoners were having similar reactions. Helmut Koch, a young machinist's mate from U-673, Klaus's own boat, was crying openly, clutching bread to his chest. Franz Dietz, a grizzled chief engineer, was laughing. An unsettling, borderline hysterical laugh. "Is it poisoned?" someone asked in German. An American guard who'd been standing by the door walked over. He was young, couldn't have been more than 20, with red hair and freckles. He picked up a piece of the bread and ate it himself, then gestured to the prisoners. "Go ahead, eat." Klaus bit into the bread. The texture was soft, slightly sweet, fresh. It wasn't fancy bread, wasn't artisanal or exotic. It was ordinary white bread, the kind meant for everyday consumption, and it was better than anything he'd eaten in 3 years. He ate slowly, each bite a revelation. Around him, prisoners were devouring their portions, some with tears streaming down their faces. They'd been told Americans were starving. They'd been told American agriculture had collapsed. They'd been told rationing had reduced American civilians to desperation. This bread was evidence of the opposite. This wasn't survival rations. This was abundance. But bread was just the beginning. After the bread came the rest of lunch. Beef stew with chunks of actual meat. Not tiny, suspicious pieces, but visible, substantial chunks. Carrots, potatoes, onions, a side of green beans, and butter. Real butter, not margarine, not the rancid substitute they'd eaten in Germany. Butter in small individual portions, one per man. Klaus ate mechanically, his mind struggling to process. The portion size was larger than what German civilians were receiving. Larger than what Wehrmacht soldiers were receiving at garrison. This was prison food. Food for enemies. And it was better than what Germany was feeding its own people. After the meal, they were shown to their barracks. Long wooden buildings with bunk beds, mattresses, pillows, blankets. Each man had a small locker for personal items. The barracks had windows with screens to keep out insects. The floor was wood, clean, swept. Klaus sat on his assigned bunk. The mattress wasn't stuffed with straw or rags. It was an actual mattress, thin but serviceable. The pillow was soft. After months of sleeping on a steel rack with a thin pad in the U-boat, this felt like luxury. "They're fattening us up," Stoltz said from the next bunk, "for interrogation. This is psychological warfare." Klaus wanted to believe that, but he was starting to understand something terrifying. What if this wasn't psychological warfare? What if this was simply normal? What if American POWs were treated like this because America could afford to treat POWs like this? That night, lying on a mattress in a heated barracks, his stomach full for the first time in months, Klaus Hartmann couldn't sleep. His mind kept circling back to a simple, devastating question. If this was how America treated its enemies, what did that say about everything he'd been told? The next morning brought new revelations. Breakfast was eggs. Real eggs, scrambled, not powdered, with toast. White toast with butter and jam. And coffee. It wasn't good coffee. It was weak, American-style coffee. But it was coffee, not the bitter ersatz substitute made from acorns and grain that they'd drunk in Germany. There was milk. White milk, not watered down or reconstituted from powder. Fresh milk. Klaus drank the coffee slowly, savoring it despite its weakness. In the U-boat, They'd received half a cup of ersatz coffee per day. Here, the American cook indicated they could have refills. After breakfast, they were taken for processing and medical examinations. The American military needed to assess each prisoner's health, take dental records, screen for diseases. Klaus filed into the medical building with a group of 20 other Germans. The waiting room had chairs, metal folding chairs, but chairs nonetheless. On a side table sat a stack of magazines: Life, Saturday Evening Post, other American publications. The magazines were from early 1944, just months old. Klaus picked one up, curiosity overcoming suspicion. The images inside shattered another layer of his understanding. Advertisements for automobiles, even though production had been converted to military vehicles. Advertisements for appliances, for food, for clothes. The advertisements themselves were startling. They were in color, professionally produced, showing abundance. A woman in a kitchen with modern appliances smiling. A family dinner with a table laden with food. A man working on a car in a suburban driveway. But it was the articles that truly struck him. Stories about war production, factories working around the clock, photographs of assembly lines producing bombers, dozens visible in a single vast factory building, a shipyard with multiple vessels under construction simultaneously, charts showing production figures that Klaus assumed must be propaganda exaggerations. One article discussed rationing in America. It listed what was rationed: sugar, coffee, butter, meat, gasoline, tires. But the ration amounts listed were astonishing. American civilians were rationed to 5 pounds of sugar per person per month. 5 pounds. In Germany, the civilian ration was 1 pound per month, when it was available at all. American meat rations were 2 pounds per person per week. German civilians were receiving less than half a pound. The article even complained about the hardship of rationing, about how difficult it was for American families to manage with such restrictions. Klaus read it twice, unable to reconcile the complaints with the numbers. Americans were complaining about receiving more than twice what Germans considered adequate. A medical orderly called his name. Klaus followed him into an examination room where an American doctor waited. The doctor was older, maybe 50, with grey hair and tired eyes. He gestured for Klaus to sit. The examination was thorough. The doctor checked Klaus's eyes, ears, throat. Listened to his heart and lungs. Examined his skin, noting the signs of vitamin deficiency: bleeding gums, easy bruising, dry skin. He checked for lice and found none, thanks to the delousing in Halifax. He noted Klaus's weight: 58 kilograms at a height of 175 centimeters. Severely underweight. The doctor made notes, then pulled out a form. Through a German-speaking translator, a prisoner who'd lived in America before the war, the doctor asked questions about Klaus's medical history, about conditions in the U-boat, about diet and sanitation. Klaus answered honestly. What did it matter now? He described the food shortages, the lack of vitamins, the inability to properly bathe for weeks. He described the cold, the dampness, the constant physical stress. The doctor listened, made notes, and when Klaus finished, he said something in English to the translator. The doctor says you should gain 10 kilograms within 6 weeks if you continue eating camp rations, the translator said. He says your teeth need work. Scurvy has damaged your gums. He'll schedule you for dental treatment. Klaus stared. Dental treatment. For a prisoner. An enemy prisoner who'd tried to sink American ships, who'd succeeded in sinking American ships. And they were going to provide dental treatment. Why? Klaus asked the translator. Why do they care? The translator conveyed the question. The doctor's response came back. Geneva Convention requires it. Also, it's simply the right thing to do. Simply the right thing to do. Klaus had been prepared for many things in captivity: brutality, interrogation, neglect, starvation. He had not been prepared for medical care based on principle. Over the following days, the evidence accumulated like water pouring into a breached compartment. Impossible to stop, impossible to ignore. May 20th, 1944. The camp library. Klaus discovered the camp had a library. A library. For prisoners. It contained books in German, not many, perhaps 30 volumes, but they existed. Books in English? Hundreds of them. Newspapers even, though they were censored to remove sensitive military information. The newspapers were American publications, showing American perspectives on the war, but they were newspapers nonetheless. Klaus picked up a Saturday Evening Post from 2 weeks prior. He read an article about a war bond drive. The article mentioned that Americans had purchased $20 billion in war bonds. $20 billion. The number was meaningless, too large to comprehend. But the casual way it was mentioned, as if it was simply what was expected, suggested resources beyond Klaus's capacity to imagine. He found himself reading the advertisements again, an advertisement for Coca-Cola showing soldiers drinking it. The pause that refreshes. An advertisement for Lucky Strike cigarettes. Lucky Strike Green has gone to war, explaining that the green dye in the package had been eliminated to save copper for the war effort. The advertisement itself was strange, companies appealing to patriotism by making minor changes, suggesting that for American civilians, contributing to the war effort was about small sacrifices, not fundamental survival. Helmut Koch joined him at the reading table. Helmut was 22 from Hamburg, had been on U-boats for 18 months. His father was a machinist at the Blohm + Voss shipyard. Before the war, Helmut had planned to follow in his father's footsteps. "Have you seen this?" Helmut pushed a magazine across the table. It was a Life magazine from March, with a cover story about American war production. Klaus flipped through it. Photographs of factories, massive structures covering acres, with assembly lines producing bombers. One photograph showed rows of B-24 Liberators, dozens of them in various stages of completion. The caption said it was a single factory in Michigan and could produce one bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. "It has to be propaganda," Helmut said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Exaggeration." "Maybe," Klaus said. But he was remembering the freight train he'd seen from the passenger car, the one carrying tanks. Dozens of tanks, fresh from factories, heading to Europe. That had been real. He'd seen it with his own eyes. May 23rd, 1944. Outdoor recreation time. The prisoners were allowed outside for exercise and recreation for 2 hours each afternoon. The recreation yard had volleyball nets, a makeshift soccer field, areas to sit and talk. Guards watched from the towers, but they didn't interfere unless someone approached the fence. Klaus stood in the recreation yard, feeling sunshine on his face. Genuine warm sunshine, not the cold grey light of the North Atlantic. He could see beyond the fence to the surrounding countryside. Farmland stretched in every direction. The farms looked prosperous. Painted buildings, maintained fences, equipment in good repair. A train passed in the distance, its whistle carrying across the fields. Klaus watched it, wondering what it carried. More tanks? More supplies? More evidence of the vast industrial machine he'd been told didn't exist. Franz Dietz joined him at the fence. Franz was 43, the oldest man from U-673 to survive. He'd been in the Kriegsmarine since 1936, had served on surface ships before volunteering for U-boats in 1942. He was from Munich, had worked in a brewery before the military. "I've been thinking," Franz said quietly in German, "about the numbers." "What numbers?" "All of them. The food, the supplies, the space." Franz gestured at the vast Iowa landscape. "Back home, everything is carefully calculated. Every ration coupon, every allocation. Because there isn't enough. There has never been enough. Even before the war, even during the good years under the Führer, it was always about making do, about efficiency, about getting the maximum from limited resources." Klaus nodded. This was true. German efficiency wasn't just propaganda, it was necessity. Germany had to be efficient because Germany didn't have enough of anything. Not enough land, not enough oil, not enough resources. Efficiency was survival. "But here," Franz continued, "they're not efficient. They waste food. Did you see them throw away half a pot of coffee yesterday? Just threw it away because it had gotten cold. At home, that coffee would have been saved, reheated, stretched with more water. Here they threw it out and made fresh. Klaus had seen it. Had been appalled by it. The casual waste. And the space," Franz said. "We travelled for 2 days on that train and never left farmland. 2 days. Iowa alone is bigger than Austria. And Iowa is just one state. One." They stood in silence, watching the distant train disappear over the horizon. "What if," Franz said slowly, "what if we never had a chance? What if the war was lost before it even started and we just didn't know it?" Klaus didn't answer. He couldn't. because the same thought had been growing in his mind like a tumor, and he wasn't ready to speak it aloud. May 25th, 1944. The camp canteen. The prisoners were allowed to use a canteen where they could purchase small items using credits earned through work details. The canteen didn't have much: cigarettes, toiletries, writing paper, stamps, but it existed, another small impossibility. Klaus had volunteered for a work detail helping maintain the campgrounds. It was light work, nothing strenuous, but it gave him something to do besides think. In exchange, he'd earned credits. He stood in the canteen, looking at the available items. Cigarettes. He didn't smoke, had never been able to afford the habit. But the cigarettes were American brands: Camel, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield, and they were affordable with his meager credits. He bought a pack of Lucky Strikes, not to smoke but to examine. The package was crisp, clean, professionally printed. Inside, 20 cigarettes, each one perfectly formed, consistent. In Germany, cigarettes were loose, often hand-rolled, quality variable. These were machine-made, mass-produced to exacting standards. On impulse, he also bought a bar of soap. Real soap, not the gritty, harsh substitute they'd used in the U-boat. The soap smelled clean, simple, but it represented something larger: the casual availability of comfort items, even for prisoners. That evening, he used the soap in the shower block. The hot water, there was always hot water, not rationed, not limited, and the soap produced an actual lather. He washed his hair for the first time in months with something that actually cleaned it. He stood under the hot water, letting it run over him, and tried not to think about his shipmates who'd gone down with U-673. Tried not to think about the propaganda that had sent them out believing they were winning. May 27, 1944. Conversation with Stolz. Kapitän Leutnant Stolz had been avoiding Klaus since arrival. Stolz was a true believer, a party member since before the war, a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in the Reich's invincibility. The cognitive dissonance of camp life was visible on his face, a tightness around the eyes, a tendency to look away from contradictions. But this evening, Stolz approached Klaus in the barracks. Most of the other prisoners were outside, enjoying the late spring evening. Stolz sat on the bunk next to Klaus's and was silent for a long moment. "My brother is in the Wehrmacht," Stolz finally said. "Infantry on the Eastern Front." His last letter from February mentioned that their rations had been cut again. They were eating less than 1,000 calories per day. Half the unit had frostbite. They were burning furniture to stay warm because fuel shipments weren't arriving. Klaus waited. "We eat 4,000 calories here," Stolz continued. His voice was flat, emotionless. "The American guards eat the same food we do. I've watched them. Same mess hall, same kitchens. This isn't special food for prisoners to deceive us. This is normal. This is what American soldiers eat." Stolz pulled out a letter he'd been writing. "I can't send this. It would never pass the censors. But I've been writing it anyway, trying to make sense of things." He unfolded the paper. "I wrote, we were told America was weak, collapsing, unable to feed its people. But America feeds its prisoners better than Germany feeds its soldiers. We were told America was divided, racially impure, on the verge of revolution. But every American I've seen seems content, well-fed, purposeful. We were told American industry was a fiction, propaganda to match our truth. But I've seen the evidence, the trains, the supplies, the casual abundance. Either everything we were told was lies, or everything I'm seeing now is an impossibly elaborate deception. I no longer know which would be worse." He folded the letter again. "I've been trying to find a way to rationalize this. To find the flaw, the trick. But Klaus, there is no trick. This is simply how things are. And if this is how things are, then we never had a chance. The war was lost before we even began, and 30,000 U-boat men died for nothing." June 2nd, 1944. Work detail outside the camp. Klaus and a group of 20 prisoners were assigned to a work detail on a nearby farm. The farmer, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson, needed help with repairs to his barn before the harvest season. The American guards supervised, but didn't interfere much. There was nowhere for prisoners to escape to. No friendly territory within 1,000 miles. The farm was large by German standards, over 200 acres. Mr. Henderson worked it with his wife, one hired hand, and modern equipment. He had a tractor, a John Deere Model B, green and yellow, well maintained. He had a truck, a Ford, for taking produce to market. He had a car, a Chevrolet, sitting in the driveway even though gasoline was rationed. Klaus worked on repairing the barn's roof. The work was simple, physical, gave him time to think. Or rather, time not to think, to focus on hammering nails and fitting boards. At midday, Mrs. Henderson brought lunch to the work detail. Sandwiches. Ham sandwiches on white bread with cheese, lettuce, tomatoes. Cookies. Lemonade. She'd made enough for all 20 prisoners and the guards. Klaus ate slowly, savouring each bite. The ham was real, not ersatz. The cheese was real. The tomatoes were fresh. This was a farm wife's casual lunch for workers. Nothing special, just what you provided when people were working on your property. After lunch, Mr. Henderson came to inspect the work. Through one of the guards who spoke some German, he chatted with Klaus. Where was Klaus from? Bremen. Had he been a sailor? Yes, U-boats. Henderson nodded, didn't seem bothered by this. His own son was in the Navy, he said, a gunner on a destroyer in the Pacific. Hunting Japanese submarines? The parallel was obvious. Klaus had hunted Allied ships. Henderson's son was hunting Axis submarines. They were enemies, and yet here was Henderson, feeding Klaus lunch, paying the camp for his labor, treating him as a human being. When the work was finished, Henderson paid the camp administrator, and the prisoners were loaded back onto the truck for return to camp. As they drove away, Klaus looked back at the farm. The neat white farmhouse, the red barn they'd just repaired, the fields green with growing crops, the modern equipment sitting in the yard. This was one farm. One of thousands, one of millions. Germany had perhaps 500,000 farms. America had 6 million. Germany's farms were smaller, less mechanized, less productive. German agriculture required 30% of the population to work the land. American agriculture, even during wartime, required less than 20%. The numbers were beginning to paint a picture Klaus couldn't ignore. June 4th, 1944. News of D-Day. The camp administrators posted news of the Normandy invasion. Allied forces had landed in France. The second front, long anticipated, had opened. The German prisoners gathered around the bulletin board, reading the announcement in silence. Some muttered about German defences, about the Atlantic Wall, about how the invasion would be thrown back into the sea. But the words sounded hollow, automatic, like prayers no one believed anymore. Klaus read the announcement twice. Thousands of ships, it said. Thousands. The largest amphibious invasion in history. The Allies had assembled so many vessels, so much equipment, so many men that they could simply overwhelm any defense through sheer mass. That night, lying in his bunk, Klaus did mathematics. He knew U-boats had sunk approximately 3,000 Allied ships since 1939. 3,000 ships in 5 years of desperate, brutal warfare. And the Allies had just assembled thousands of ships for a single operation, plus all the ships continuing to run convoys, plus all the ships fighting in the Pacific, plus all the ships being built in American and British shipyards at a rate Klaus couldn't even conceptualize. Germany had lost. That much was becoming clear. The only question was how long it would take for the inevitable to occur. June 10th, 1944. Letter from home. The Red Cross delivered mail. Klaus received a letter from his mother, dated April 3rd, 2 months old. She wrote in careful language, knowing censors would read it. She was well, she said. His father was well. They were managing. Hamburg had experienced more air raids. The house was intact, but many in the neighborhood had been damaged. Food was scarce, but they were managing. She missed him. She prayed for his safety. Between the lines, Klaus read the truth. Hamburg was being bombed regularly. Food was very scarce. They were not managing well. His mother was trying to reassure him because she thought he was suffering in prison. He sat in the barracks, holding the letter, and felt something break inside him. His mother was hungry in Hamburg. He was gaining weight in Iowa. His father was probably working himself to exhaustion in the shipyards. Klaus had eaten ham sandwiches on a farm. The Wehrmacht was eating less than 1,000 calories per day on the Eastern Front. Klaus had just eaten a dinner of pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans, and apple pie. Apple pie. The Americans had served apple pie for dessert in a prison camp. For enemies, Klaus put his head in his hands and tried not to weep. June 15th, 1944. Conversation with a guard. One of the regular guards at Camp Clarinda was a corporal named Jimmy Patterson. He was from Tennessee, 23 years old, had been drafted in 1942. He'd wanted to go overseas but had been assigned to camp duty because of poor eyesight. He seemed to feel this was somehow shameful, as if guarding prisoners wasn't real service. Patterson had picked up some German from the prisoners and liked to practice. His German was terrible, but he tried. One afternoon during recreation time, he sat near where Klaus was reading and struck up a conversation in broken German and English. Patterson wanted to know about U-boats. What was it like? Was it scary? How did you navigate underwater? Klaus answered carefully at first, then more openly. Why not? The war was over for him. The information wouldn't help Germany now. He described the cramped quarters, the constant danger, the fear of depth charges, the claustrophobia. Patterson listened with genuine interest. Then Patterson talked about growing up in Tennessee, about his family's farm, about how different Iowa was from home. Flatter, more open, better soil. Do you miss it? Klaus asked. Tennessee? Sure, Patterson said. But I'll get back there after the war. Farm's still there. My folks are still there. Nothing's changed much, except my brother went into the Navy. Nothing's changed much. The casual statement revealed volumes. America was fighting a massive global war, and for most Americans, nothing had changed much. They still had their farms, their families, their homes. They had rationing, sure, but nothing fundamental had been destroyed or transformed. Klaus thought about Hamburg, about the bombed neighborhoods, the destroyed buildings, the refugees flooding in from the east. About Berlin, about the eastern cities falling to the Soviets. Germany wasn't going to return to normal after the war. Germany might not exist as they knew it after the war. What do you think you'll do? Patterson asked. After the war, I mean, when you go home. Klaus didn't know how to answer. Would there be a home? Would Bremen still exist? Would there be shipyards to work at, or would they be rubble? Would the Germany he returned to bear any resemblance to the Germany he'd left? I don't know, Klaus said honestly. Patterson nodded, seemed to understand the weight of the uncertainty. He offered Klaus a cigarette from his pack. Klaus took it, let Patterson light it for him, and they sat smoking in silence, a prisoner and a guard, two young men caught up in something bigger than either of them understood. June 20th, 1944. The movie. The camp showed a movie in the recreation hall. It was an American film from before the war, a comedy with actors Klaus didn't recognize. The film itself wasn't important, some story about mistaken identities and romance. What was important was that the camp showed movies at all. Klaus sat in the recreation hall with 200 other prisoners, watching images flicker on the screen. The movie was in English without subtitles, so he couldn't follow the dialogue, but he could see the setting. An American city, big buildings, cars everywhere, people dressed well, restaurants, shops, abundance visible in every frame. Even accounting for Hollywood exaggeration, the casual wealth was striking. In one scene, the characters went to a restaurant. The table was laden with food, steaks, potatoes, vegetables, bread, wine. The characters barely touched most of it, too busy with their romantic complications to eat. The waste was staggering. Klaus heard muttering around him in German. Other prisoners were having the same reaction. All that food, wasted for a movie scene. After the film, walking back to the barracks, Helmut said, "Even their fantasies are about abundance. They can't even imagine deprivation enough to make it realistic." It was true. American propaganda showed strength, confidence, inevitable victory. German propaganda increasingly showed sacrifice, determination, fighting spirit against the odds. The difference was telling. June 28, 1944. Medical checkup. Klaus returned to the medical building for a follow-up examination. The American doctor weighed him, noted with satisfaction that he'd gained 6 kilograms in 6 weeks. His gums were healing. His skin looked healthier. The vitamin deficiency was resolving. "You see," the doctor said through the translator. "Good food, rest, proper care. You'll be healthy soon?" Klaus nodded. He wanted to ask, why? Why do you care about the health of an enemy who killed your sailors? But he already knew the answer. Because they could afford to. Because America had enough resources that even basic human decency toward enemies didn't strain their system. July 4th, 1944. Independence Day. The camp celebrated American Independence Day. The prisoners weren't required to participate, but they could watch. The American guards had the day off in shifts, celebrating their national holiday. There was a baseball game between two guard units. There was extra food, hamburgers, hot dogs, potato salad, watermelon. The guards' families came to visit, a special dispensation for the holiday. Klaus watched from the recreation yard. Children ran around playing. Women in summer dresses sat on blankets. Men played baseball, shouted, laughed. Music played from a radio someone had brought. It was a scene of such normalcy, such peace, such abundance that it seemed to come from another world. One of the guards' wives had brought her children, 2 boys, maybe 6 and 8 years old. They were healthy, well-fed, wearing clean clothes, playing with toys. The mother watched them with casual affection, calling out warnings when they ran too close to the fence. Klaus watched the children and thought about German children, about the photographs he'd seen in letters from home. Children looking thin, wearing patched clothes, their eyes too old for their faces. About the children who'd been evacuated from cities to escape the bombing. About the children who'd been killed in the bombing. These American children didn't know there was a war. Oh, they knew intellectually. Their fathers were in uniform. They collected scrap metal for war drives. They saw propaganda posters. But they didn't know war. They'd never heard an air raid siren. They'd never gone hungry. They'd never seen their homes destroyed. Germany's children knew war intimately. They would carry its scars forever. July 10th, 1944. The breaking point. It happened over something small, insignificant. A piece of cake. The camp had received a donation from a local church group, cakes, homemade by church ladies as a gesture of Christian charity toward the prisoners. Each prisoner received a slice. The cake was simple, yellow cake with chocolate frosting, nothing fancy. Klaus received his slice and stared at it. Cake. For prisoners. Donated by civilians who had enough surplus sugar, flour, butter, eggs that they could bake cakes for enemy prisoners. He took a bite. It was sweet, rich, made with real ingredients. He could taste the butter, the real chocolate in the frosting. It was better than any cake he'd eaten in Germany, even before the war, even during the brief prosperity of the late 30s. And something in him snapped. The propaganda had lied. About everything. They'd said America was weak, collapsing, unable to feed its people. But Americans were baking cakes for German prisoners. They'd said American industry was fiction. But American factories were producing ships faster than U-boats could sink them, planes faster than flak could shoot them down, tanks faster than panzers could destroy them. They'd said Americans were decadent, soft, unwilling to fight. But Americans were fighting on 2 fronts, supplying allies, building weapons, and still had enough abundance to treat prisoners humanely. The mathematics was undeniable. Germany had entered a war it could never win. The industrial capacity simply didn't exist. The resources didn't exist. The food didn't exist. Germany had survived as long as it had through conquest, through looting occupied territories, through brutal efficiency. But efficiency couldn't overcome arithmetic. 10 German workers, no matter how dedicated, couldn't outproduce 100 American workers with better tools, better resources, and better supply chains. Klaus set down the cake, his hands shaking. Around him, other prisoners were eating, some savoring the treat, some eating mechanically. He looked at them and saw men who'd been lied to. Men who'd risked their lives, watched their friends die, killed the enemy, all for a cause that had been doomed from the start. The Reich had sent them to war with inferior resources, inadequate supplies, and lies. Lies about German superiority, lies about Allied weakness, lies about inevitable victory. And men had died for those lies. Good men, brave men, men who'd deserved better than to be sacrificed for a fantasy. Klaus thought about his crewmates who'd gone down with U-673. 32 men, trapped in a steel coffin, drowning in the dark Atlantic. What had their last thoughts been? Had they died believing in the Reich? Had they died thinking their sacrifice mattered? He thought about the merchant sailors he'd killed. Thousands of them, over 3 years of patrols. Men on freighters, tankers, cargo ships. Men who'd been trying to deliver food, fuel, supplies. Men who probably had families, who probably thought about home, who probably wanted to survive as much as Klaus had wanted to survive. And for what? To delay the inevitable for a few months? To give the Reich a few more weeks of false hope? Klaus put his head in his hands, and for the first time since childhood, he wept openly. Great, racking sobs that shook his entire body. The other prisoners looked at him, some with understanding, some with alarm. Helmut came over, put a hand on his shoulder, said nothing. There was nothing to say. The truth was undeniable now. The war was lost. The Reich was doomed. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd believed in, was built on lies. And there was nothing they could do but wait for the inevitable end. That evening, Klaus sat with Franz and Helmut in the barracks. Most of the other prisoners were outside, enjoying the summer evening, but the three of them needed to talk. "I can't lie to myself anymore," Klaus said. "I've tried. God knows I've tried, but the evidence is overwhelming." Franz nodded. "I came to the same conclusion weeks ago. I just couldn't say it out loud." "We were lied to," Helmut said. His voice was bitter. "About everything. The Führer, the party, the military command. They sent us to die for lies. Not just us," Klaus said. "Everyone, every soldier, every civilian, everyone in the Reich. They've been fed propaganda while the leadership knew the truth. They had to know. They had the intelligence reports, the production figures, the real numbers. They knew we couldn't win. And they sent us to war anyway. Why?" Helmut asked. "If they knew, why start a war they couldn't win?" "I don't know," Klaus said. "Ideology, insanity, belief in their own propaganda. Does it matter? The result is the same. Germany is being destroyed, and millions are dying, and it's all for nothing." They sat in silence for a long moment. "What do we do?" Franz finally asked. "When the war ends, when we go home, what do we do with this knowledge?" "We tell the truth," Klaus said. "We tell everyone what we saw here. We tell them about the abundance, the industry, the treatment. We tell them that the propaganda was lies. Maybe then they'll understand why we lost. Maybe then we can build something real instead of fantasies." "They won't believe us," Helmut said. "They'll think we've been brainwashed, turned by the Americans. They'll call us traitors." "Maybe," Klaus said, "but we have to try. We owe it to the men who died believing the lies." Over the following weeks and months, Klaus settled into a strange routine. The war continued in Europe. German cities bombed, Soviet forces advancing from the east, Allied forces pushing through France. News filtered into the camp through newspapers, radio broadcasts, official announcements. Each piece of news confirmed what Klaus already knew. Germany was losing, steadily and inevitably. August 1944. Paris was liberated. Klaus read the announcement and felt nothing. It was simply another step in the inevitable progression. September 1940. Allied forces reached the German border. Klaus wondered if his family in Bremen was safe, if the city had been bombed again, if they had enough food. October 1944. Klaus had gained 15 kilograms since arriving at Camp Clarinda. He looked healthy for the first time in years. His fellow prisoners showed similar transformations. Men who'd arrived gaunt and sick were now healthy, well-fed, almost content. The camp had settled into routine. Work details, recreation time, meals, sleep. Some prisoners took classes: English language, mathematics, mechanics. The camp administrators encouraged education, preparing prisoners for eventual return to civilian life. Klaus took an English class. He figured he might need it. If Germany lost, when Germany lost, the world would be shaped by English-speaking powers. Better to learn the language of the victors. December 1944. The camp held a Christmas celebration. Not for the prisoners exactly, but the prisoners could observe. The American Guards had a Christmas party with decorations, gifts, food. Someone donated a Christmas tree for the camp chapel where services were held for both American Guards and German prisoners who wanted to attend. Klaus attended Christmas service, though he wasn't particularly religious. The chaplain, an American captain, gave a sermon about peace on earth, goodwill toward men. He acknowledged the prisoners in attendance, spoke about how all men were brothers under God, how the war would end someday, and men would have to find ways to live together again. After the service, the chaplain shook hands with prisoners, wished them Merry Christmas in fractured German. Klaus shook his hand, mumbled thanks. The chaplain pressed something into his hand, a chocolate bar. "Merry Christmas, son," he said in English. Klaus returned to the barracks holding the chocolate. Helmut saw it and laughed, not unkindly. They're extraordinary, aren't they? Even their priests carry around surplus chocolate. January 1945. News of the Soviet advance accelerated. The Red Army was pushing into Poland, into East Prussia. German refugees were fleeing west, millions of them trying to escape Soviet revenge. Klaus worried about his family. Bremen was in the west, should be safe from the Soviets. But the Western Allies were advancing too, and Bremen was a port city, a military target. Where could his family go? Was anywhere safe? He wrote letters home, though he didn't know if they'd arrive. The Red Cross handled prisoner mail, but the German postal system was collapsing under the strain of war. He wrote anyway, telling his mother he was safe, he was well, she shouldn't worry. He didn't tell her about the abundance, about his realization of the propaganda lies. What would be the point? She couldn't do anything with that information, except despair. March 1945. News reached the camp that Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. The last major barrier to Germany's heartland had fallen. The war would be over soon. Klaus felt strange about it. Relief that the killing would stop. Grief for Germany's destruction. Anxiety about what came next. Would there even be a Germany to return to? What would occupation look like? What would the Allies do to a defeated enemy? He knew what Germany had done to its defeated enemies. Poland, France, Russia. If the Allies chose revenge, if they did to Germany what Germany had done to others, there would be nothing left. April 1945. News of Hitler's death reached the camp. Suicide in Berlin as Soviet forces closed in. The Reich was collapsing, the government fragmenting. German forces were surrendering en masse. Some prisoners reacted with shock, grief, anger. True believers who couldn't accept that the Führer was gone, that the Reich was finished. Others reacted with relief, even quiet satisfaction. The architect of Germany's destruction had finally faced consequences. Klaus felt mostly numb. Hitler's death changed nothing. The war was lost, Germany was destroyed, millions were dead. One more death, even Hitler's, seemed almost meaningless in the context of such vast catastrophe. May 8, 1945, VE Day. Victory in Europe. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The camp administration posted the announcement. The war in Europe was over. Nazi Germany had ceased to exist. The Third Reich, promised to last 1,000 years, had lasted 12. Klaus read the announcement surrounded by other prisoners. Some wept. Some stood stoic. Some seemed relieved. After 6 years of total war, it was finally over. That evening, the American Guard celebrated. Klaus could hear them from the barracks. Music, laughter, shouting. They'd won! They had every right to celebrate. Klaus lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. The war was over. He'd survived. He was healthy, safe, well-fed. His family might be alive. The killing had stopped, and Germany was gone. Not just defeated, but erased. The country he'd known, the government he'd served, the society he'd grown up in, all gone, replaced by Allied occupation zones and an uncertain future. What came next? The answer came slowly, over months and years. June 1945. The camp population swelled as more German POWs were transferred from Europe. Men who'd surrendered in the final weeks of the war, who'd been held in temporary camps, who were now being processed for longer-term imprisonment or repatriation. The new arrivals brought stories. Stories of Germany's final collapse, of cities in ruins, of civilian populations starving, of infrastructure destroyed. Stories of Soviet occupation in the East, brutal and vengeful. Stories of Western Allied occupation, surprisingly humane given what Germany had done. Klaus talked with the new arrivals, gathering information about Bremen. The city had been heavily bombed, they said. The port was destroyed. Much of the city centre was rubble, but people were surviving, scraping by under British occupation. His family might be alive. He had to believe that. September 1945. Japan surrendered. The war was completely over on all fronts. The world could finally begin recovering. Klaus had been a prisoner for 16 months. In that time, he'd gained weight, learned English, worked various jobs, and fundamentally transformed his understanding of the world. The propaganda had been lies, but more than that, the entire worldview that had sent Germany to war had been fundamentally flawed. German superiority wasn't real. American weakness was fiction. The mathematics of industrial capacity, of resources, of population. These things mattered more than ideology or fighting spirit. Germany had bet everything on will and discipline overcoming material disadvantage, and the bet had failed catastrophically. November 1945. Repatriation began. Not all prisoners, not immediately, but the process started. Those with families, those from the Western zones, those deemed lower risk, they began the journey home. Klaus wasn't in the first groups. His U-boat service marked him as military rather than conscript, made him lower priority for release. He would have to wait. He didn't mind. What was the rush? Germany was destroyed. Jobs didn't exist. Food was scarce. At least in Camp Clarinda, he ate regularly. March 1946. Klaus was finally selected for repatriation. 2 years after his capture, nearly a year after Germany's surrender, he would go home. The journey back was strange. A ship across the Atlantic, as a passenger this time, not a prisoner, though the distinction was blurry, landing in Bremerhaven, or what was left of it, processing through British military administration, then finally a truck to Bremen. He'd prepared himself for destruction, but the reality was still shocking. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Buildings that had stood for centuries were gone, leaving only foundations and chimneys. Streets barely passable, cleared just enough for military traffic. People living in basements and makeshift shelters, wearing patched clothes, looking thin and exhausted. This was the Germany he'd fought for. This was the result of the Reich's ambitions. He found his family's apartment building. It was damaged but standing, the upper floors destroyed by bombing, but the ground floor intact. His mother answered the door. She didn't recognize him at first. He'd left as a thin, hungry U-boat man. He'd returned healthy, well-fed, wearing American surplus clothes. When recognition hit, she sobbed and pulled him inside. His father was there, older and thinner, but alive. They'd survived the bombing, survived the collapse, survived the occupation. They were living in 2 rooms of the damaged building, sharing resources with neighbors, getting by on British rations supplemented by black market trading. They wanted to know everything. Where had he been? How had he survived? What was it like? Klaus told them about Camp Clarinda. About the food, the treatment, the abundance. They listened with expressions of disbelief that Klaus recognized. He'd worn the same expression himself 2 years ago. "You're telling us," his mother said slowly, "that American prisoners ate better than we did?" "American prisoners ate better than Wehrmacht soldiers," Klaus said. "I gained 15 kilograms in captivity." His father shook his head. "Then we never had a chance, did we? If they could afford to feed prisoners that well, while we were starving our own soldiers—" "No," Klaus said. "We never had a chance. The war was lost before it began. We just didn't know it." Over the following weeks, Klaus tried to rebuild a life in the ruins of Bremen. There were no shipyard jobs. The shipyards were destroyed. He worked odd jobs, manual labor, whatever he could find. He used his English to get work with British occupation authorities, translating, helping with administration. He talked with other veterans, compared experiences. Those who'd been prisoners in America told similar stories: abundance, humane treatment, the shattering realization of propaganda lies. Those who'd been prisoners in Britain reported similar conditions, though with less abundance. Those who'd been prisoners in the Soviet Union, the few who returned, told horror stories of starvation, forced labor, death. The contrast was telling. The Western Allies could afford mercy. The Soviets, devastated by German invasion, chose revenge. Klaus married in 1948. A Bremen girl, Greta, whose family had survived the war. They had a small apartment in a partially rebuilt building. They made do on limited income, supplemented by Marshall Plan aid that was beginning to flow into Western Germany. The Americans were rebuilding their former enemy, helping Germany recover, investing in German industry. More evidence of the staggering abundance Klaus had witnessed. America could afford to rebuild Germany while also rebuilding Britain, France, Italy, Japan. The industrial capacity was simply that vast. Klaus got a proper job at a rebuilt shipyard. Not building warships, Germany was prohibited from significant military production, but merchant vessels. The shipyard was being rebuilt with Marshall Plan funds, equipped with modern tools, integrated into international trade networks. The new Germany was different from the old. Democracy instead of dictatorship. integration with the West instead of aggressive expansion, acknowledgement of crimes instead of glorification of the past. It wasn't easy. Many Germans struggled with the new reality, clung to old beliefs, made excuses. But Klaus knew better. He'd seen the alternative. He'd seen what real abundance looked like, what a healthy society looked like, what values actually worked. An American historian researching POW experiences tracked Klaus down in Bremen. The historian wanted to interview former prisoners about their experiences, their treatment, their reactions to American abundance. Klaus, now 43, married with 2 children, working as a foreman at the shipyard, agreed to the interview. They met at a cafe in the rebuilt city centre. New buildings designed in a modern style, traffic flowing, people prosperous. The historian asked about Klaus's capture, his time at Camp Clarinda, his reactions to American conditions. Klaus talked for 2 hours. About the U-boat service, the propaganda, the capture, the train ride across America, the bread on his first day. About the accumulation of evidence, the breaking point, the realization that everything he'd been told was lies. What was the moment, the historian asked, when you knew for certain that Germany had lost? Klaus thought about it. The cake, he finally said. In July 1944, local American civilians donated cakes to the POW camp, homemade cakes baked by church ladies as charity. Each prisoner got a slice. I took one bite and understood everything. A nation that could spare sugar, flour, butter, eggs to bake cakes for enemy prisoners was a nation with resources we couldn't compete with. The cake wasn't just food. It was proof of everything we'd been lied to about. America wasn't collapsing. America was so abundant that even its charity toward enemies exceeded Germany's ability to feed its own people. The historian made notes. Do you think your experience changed you? Made you different from Germans who didn't experience American captivity? Yes, Klaus said. Most definitely. I saw behind the propaganda. I understood that German superiority was a lie, that our ideology was built on fantasy. Many Germans still struggle with that truth. They make excuses, blame betrayal, refuse to accept that we simply lost because we were outmatched. But I can't lie to myself. I saw the truth with my own eyes. Do you think it made a difference? The historian asked. Your experiences, others like you who saw American reality? Klaus considered. Maybe. After the war, some veterans helped build the new Germany. We understood that the old ways had failed, that we needed something different. We'd seen what worked: democracy, rule of law, integration with the West. We helped push Germany in that direction. So yes, maybe it made a difference. The interview ended. The historian thanked Klaus, packed up his notes, left. Klaus sat in the cafe a while longer, drinking coffee. Real coffee, good German coffee, better than the weak American coffee he'd drunk in the camp, but not as meaningful. He thought about U-673, about his crewmates who'd died in the Atlantic, about the merchant sailors he'd killed, about the 6 years of war, the millions dead, the destruction. All for lies, all for a fantasy of superiority that had never been real. But something positive had emerged from the ashes. Germany was free now, democratic, prosperous, integrated with Europe and the West. The new Germany wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It acknowledged its crimes, learned from its mistakes, built something better from the ruins. Klaus had played a small part in that, by refusing to accept the old lies, by telling the truth about what he'd experienced, by helping build the new Germany instead of mourning the old. The bread had broken his belief, but it had also shown him the truth. And truth, however painful, was always better than lies. Klaus was 55, approaching retirement. His children were grown, a son who was an engineer, a daughter who was a teacher. His grandchildren were being raised in a peaceful, prosperous Germany that bore no resemblance to the Germany of his youth. A documentary filmmaker wanted to interview him. There was renewed interest in the war, in personal stories, in understanding how ordinary Germans had experienced the Nazi period and its aftermath. Klaus agreed, though he was tired of talking about the war. But he felt he owed it to history to ensure the truth was recorded. The interview was filmed in his apartment. The filmmaker asked the usual questions: his service, his capture, his experiences in America. Klaus gave the usual answers, refined over years of telling the story. But at the end, the filmmaker asked something new. Looking back over 30 years, What do you think was the most important thing you learned from your experience? Klaus thought for a long moment before answering. I learned, he said slowly, that propaganda works until it meets reality. The Reich told us we were superior, that our enemies were weak, that we would triumph through will and discipline. And we believed it because everyone around us confirmed it, because dissent was punished, because we wanted to believe it. But propaganda can't change mathematics. It can't create resources that don't exist. It can't make a small industrial base equal a large one. It can't make hunger equal abundance. I learned that in a prison camp in Iowa, eating white bread and watching trains carry supplies across an endless continent. The Reich's propaganda shattered against the reality of American abundance. And once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. The most important lesson, reality always wins. Always. You can lie to yourself, lie to your people, build an entire ideology on fantasy. But eventually, reality catches up. And when it does, the price is paid in blood and ruins. Germany paid that price. Millions died, cities were destroyed, a nation was divided. All because we believed lies instead of acknowledging reality. I tell this story so that future generations remember, so they don't make the same mistakes. So they understand that truth, however uncomfortable, is always preferable to comforting lies. The filmmaker nodded, made notes, thanked Klaus for his time. After the crew left, Klaus stood at his apartment window, looking out at Bremen. The city was rebuilt now, modern, prosperous. Church spires rose above new buildings. Traffic flowed on paved streets. People walked freely, well-fed, well-dressed, going about their lives in peace. This was the Germany that had emerged from the ashes. Not the 1,000-year Reich of propaganda fantasy, but something more modest and more real. A nation that acknowledged its crimes, learned from its mistakes, and built something better. Klaus never forgot the bread. Decades later, whenever he saw white bread, in a bakery window, on his own table, in his grandchildren's hands, he remembered. Remembered the steam rising from 17 loaves, the impossible abundance, the moment his certainty shattered. That bread had accomplished what weapons never could. It had shown him the truth, and truth, Klaus had learned, was the most powerful force of all.